Welcome everyone, they call me Intro Tech Out, and I wasn't entirely sure if I was going to like Ratchet Clank Rift Apart. The reason for it is that I didn't enjoy the 2016 reboot much. Both the storytelling and story itself were subpar in my opinion, mostly resulting from the game borrowing parts of the Ratchet movie and gluing it together in awkward ways. But you know what? Even though I love well-told stories with memorable soundtracks backing them up, sometimes all a game needs is some stellar gameplay. And that's where Ratchet 2016 really failed to capture my interest. This is not something everyone will agree with, but I found the combat of Ratchet 2016 to be floaty, unsatisfying, boring and repetitive. I didn't hate it per se, but I definitely didn't love it either. So yeah, you can imagine that even though I was very much interested in Rift Apart, I wasn't entirely sure if I would actually enjoy it. Luckily though, Insomniac clearly saw some improvement potential with 2016 as well, and proceeded to create a game that I really liked in the end. The story was still not being mind-blowing or anything, was cohesive and solid. The graphics and effects were insane. The animation was a, let's say, astronomical leap in quality.
Oh, and it's autographed. To Ratchet and Clank, the chillest dudes I've ever hung out with on a hostile alien planet. Cool. What's so special about the blimp?
Just find a way up to that rooftop. I gotta grab my gear. But I'll meet you up there.
But most of all, the gameplay was good enough that until the very end I was looking forward to fights instead of dreading them. So as a part of this design analysis, let's look at the changes Insomniac made and let's see if we can learn some fundamentals about satisfying gameplay and combat design. Now you might find it weird that I'm citing such a huge difference between 2016 and Rift Apart. After all, Ratchet & Clank's gameplay has largely remained the same through the years. And when you look at the gameplay of 2016 and Rift Apart, they do look very similar, to the point where even I questioned my own opinion on this. But after playing both for a bit again, I legit prefer Rift Apart much more. And whenever one has a strong opinion, there has to be a reason for it. So let's get into it. One of the first things you might notice is the difference in camera angles. The camera in 2016 was quite boring. The camera was centered, meaning Ratchet was always in the middle of your screen, even when aiming. Aiming barely made the camera zoom in, it just put it a bit higher above Ratchet. In Rift Apart, the camera is more dynamic. It's slightly closer at your normal view, but it really takes on an intense camera angle while aiming. The camera flies off to the right, putting the character on the side of the screen. This allows us to get closer to the character without them obscuring the action or going off screen, like what happens in 2016. I don't know the science behind close camera angles, but they inherently feel more epic. Think about the Batman games, would they really feel as grounded if the camera was always pulled away as far as in combat? Even controlling vehicles feels more epic when the camera gets in close. Think about a jet with a camera angle from the wing instead of far behind it. Something small that Rift Apart also does is add depth of field to the camera when you aim at someone. As simple as the thing it is, the increased level of perceived quality is truly worth whatever hardware resources it takes. Any scene immediately feels more realistic and beautiful when depth of field is added. Just make sure that if you ever intend to use the technique yourself, don't go overboard. You don't want most of the world to be out of focus all the time. The last change Insomniac made to the camera is that the crosshair stays on screen while in combat, and the character points in the camera direction. This in contrast to 2016, where Ratchet detaches from the camera the moment you let go of the aim button. While hip firing was possible, it could be quite awkward, making aiming pretty much required when trying to hit enemies. I'm guessing this is the reason why they didn't give aiming a zoomed in intense angle, because players would spend all their time in it. In Rift Apart, I don't believe there's any advantage you get from aiming except the obvious finer camera control you get. This whole change definitely makes fights flow better because it no longer feels like you're changing from movement to combat mode all the time. What I now want to turn to is weapon impact. This is really where I felt a large difference with 2016. The shooting mechanics feel so much better to me in Rift Apart that I would describe 2016 as feeling like a platformer with shooting mechanics and Rift Apart as a shooter with platforming mechanics. The topic of weapon impact has always fascinated me, as the final result is usually made up of tons of little decisions by the developers. Let's start with the obvious. Haptic feedback. If Rift Apart is one of your first PS5 games, the immediate thing that will of course stand out is the incredible feel of, well, doing anything in this game because of the haptic feedback of the DualSense controller. One of the biggest differences between haptic feedback and rumble is that haptics can simulate impacts. That allows for footsteps to be felt through the controller, or melee hits, or weapons being fired. So instead of feeling your controller vibrate a certain frequency when you shoot, you feel each impact of every shot. This adds a lot to the feel of the weapons. If you want to feel an example of haptics done wrong, play Borderlands 3. While the developers technically implemented haptic feedback for the PS5 version, they used rumble patterns for all actions in-game instead of impact patterns. The result is that there is no texture basically to the feedback, all weapons rumble the same. Along with great haptic feedback, Rift Apart also makes heavy use of the adaptive triggers. I was very skeptical about these and still somewhat am for multiplayer games, but Rift Apart won me over. Every weapon now has a satisfying trigger resistance to it that you need to overcome. I love how the pistol in Control felt as well because of it. Rift Apart also does some other interesting things with it, like showing you a grenade arc when you press the trigger halfway until the resistance point. It's a neat little feature that means you won't have to actually aim to aim, if you understand what I'm saying. This is besides the point though. Haptic feedback makes games way more satisfying, but it's far from the only thing that Rift Apart does differently from its predecessor. When I talk about weapon impact, hit feedback is probably the most important part of the equation. Shooting needs to feel good, but hitting something really needs to feel good. In 2016 this was not the case, so let's compare a very similar weapon, the Combustor in 2016 and the Blast Pistol in Rift Apart. In 2016 you can see that first of all the muzzle flash doesn't look like it has any force behind it, probably because it stays too uniform and stays on screen for too long. Besides that, the actual projectiles just disappear on impact with a flash. A glowy red texture remains and disappears quickly. When shooting enemies, this impact isn't there, the projectile just disappears. The enemy will perform a stagger animation. Rift Apart has a lot more going on. Making full use of the PS5, Insomniac ups the particle effects and effects in general to 11. The difference is obvious. From the muzzle flash, to the projectiles, to the particle trails, there's a lot more fidelity to everything. What sticks out to me though is the absolute rain of empty cartridges that the Blast Pistol spits out. It's such a nice detail that acts as some nice secondary motion to support and enhance the primary action of the weapon firing. Adding secondary motion to weapons is always a good idea and something I myself should probably do more often. Compared to the Combustor, the projectiles of the Blast Pistol are smaller, making the weapon feel more powerful. This might sound counterintuitive, but the larger a projectile is, the more blunt the impact will appear. Doom Eternal has in my opinion both the best designed and most satisfying gun combat ever, and even in that game the plasma rifle and rocket launcher still feel relatively weak when they don't vaporize enemies in an instant. What instead feels good is weapons that puncture and pierce, weapons that rip and tear, if you will. In this regard, Rift Apart does a much better job than Ratchet 2016. Real quickly, I want to remind you of something I discussed in the Doom Eternal video. Enemies need to react to getting shot, and the more ridiculous the reaction is, the more satisfying hitting them becomes. It's genuinely hard to overdo impact. In Eternal, enemies are destructible, meaning hitting them results in an explosion of flash. Combine this with the falter that results from heavy hits, and shooting demons suddenly becomes as satisfying as performing glory kills in Doom 2016. Insomniac with Rift Apart recognizes the same thing that Doom Eternal did, and made enemies destructible as well, though of course to a much lesser family-friendly extent. Where Ratchet 2016 only made enemies stagger a bit, Rift Apart makes them flash red upon every hit and makes armor parts shoot off in all directions. Just like camera shake and reload animations, do not underestimate the difference that this makes. I've worked on destructible enemies in Dreams for a while now, and I almost can't play my previous game anymore because of how non-impactful combat feels. Just take this as a general rule. Everything you can do to show the impact of a weapon should be done. Physical bullet impacts on enemies, destructible limbs, flesh or armor, blood splatter or sparks, falters, general reaction animations. Also, playing some sort of sound effect for when an enemy is hit is a great way to increase hit feedback. Beware of hit markers though, they can make hits feel really satisfying when done well, but also can make them feel really weak when done wrong. For example, Uncharted 2's gunplay feels more satisfying to me than Uncharted 4, to a large part because of hit markers. There's one less secret sauce that Rift Apart utilizes for weapon feedback. While analyzing both Ratchet 2016 and Rift Apart, I was stuck for a while. I looked at the Combustor and then the Blast Pistol and then the Combustor again, and I felt like I was missing something. The Blast Pistol didn't just feel better to fire at enemies, but at walls too, and even at the empty sky. I didn't believe it was the haptics alone, there had to be something more fundamental that I hadn't recognized yet. What I believe that something to be is the Crosshair. In 2016 the Crosshair aesthetic is this bold hexagon shape at the center of your screen. In Rift Apart though, you have a really high-tech looking reticle that, and here it comes, opens up when firing. This might again seem like a small thing, but as someone who has some experience making shooter now, a reticle that opens up in lockstep with fired shots genuinely makes a weapon feel more dynamic, fun and powerful. Things like these show the amount of unrecognized effort that is put into games. Devs had to come up with this crosshair system, design a crosshair and program it to move this way. But even as someone who puts effort into analyzing everything that contributes to combat, I completely glossed over the heads-up display and took it for granted. Before I move on from weapon design to actual combat design, I do want to mention that sound design for weapons is important as well. Though I have to do quite a bit of sound design for my games, it's a topic I'm still not too confident in. What I will say is that the combustor sounds really weak, it has no punch to it, it sounds compressed and distorted. Funnily enough, even though the blast pistol also doesn't sound too powerful when listening to a video, the DualSense creates a heavy impact feeling that travels through your body and ends up registering as a punchy bass in your ears. If you have the game, turn off the haptics for a while and notice the significant difference it makes. That concludes my thoughts on weapon impact in Rift Apart. As you've surely noticed, there's a lot going on in that department, but very little actual gameplay related. Haptic feedback, moving crosshairs, destructible enemies, little of this changes how the game plays. It does however change the feel significantly and just shows how important presentation is. Would I have liked Rift Apart's gameplay if Insomniac had only made these changes? Maybe, but the game also plays differently from 2016. Let's talk about that. The gameplay in Rift Apart feels faster and more dynamic. That's first of all because Insomniac added 3 much appreciated mechanics: sprinting, dashing and boosting. In 2016 you can only move at one speed. This is not a problem in theory, but by giving you no easy way out of a bad position, enemies couldn't pressure you too much. By giving you no easy way into a good position, enemies couldn't be too mobile. The result? Arena design was almost non-existent. More or less every fight takes place on a flat plane with you on one side and the enemies on the other. In terms of gameplay, every fight eventually turned into mindless firing of weapons while jumping or running from left to right. I've mentioned Doom Eternal already this video, and I'm expecting to mention it at least once every one of these videos I do. Because what's another thing that we learned from that game? When the player is thinking, they're engaged. When they don't have to think, the game starts feeling repetitive, aka Ratchet 2016. The best way to force a player to think and make decisions is by putting more pressure on them. And that's what Rift Apart does, or rather that's what Rift Apart was able to do because of the enhanced movement mechanics. And it's not the amount of enemies that creates pressure in the game, it's their behavior. In Rift Apart, enemy AI is noticeably more aggressive. There are constant groups of enemies that run after you, forcing you to either find the most effective strategy in the moment or dash around the arena. In 2016 you bring the fight to the enemies, in Rift Apart they bring the fight to you. It's no Doom Eternal by any means, but the couple design similarities it has definitely made it a more engaging game. And on the topic of combat arenas, their design is so much better. Because of the Rift Tether and the earlier mentioned movement mechanics, you'll now see verticality everywhere. Overhang bridges, tons of cover, stairs, rocks, you name it. Enemies take these positions too, making combat feel that much more dynamic. In Rift Apart, I felt that I could really sense the designers' intentions. It looked like they had fun coming up with the arenas. I sometimes jokingly say that I want every game to have a dash mechanic. While that's not necessarily the case, I've seen now with games like Rift Apart, like Doom Eternal, that enhanced movement can help so much with making combat engaging, just like a double jump helps with making platforming engaging. It breaks up the monotony of strafing and running. It creates the opportunity to increase enemy aggressiveness by a lot, forcing the players to stay engaged. Now is Rift Apart's combat perfect? No. There are some criticisms I have. First of all, there is decent enemy variety, but it wouldn't have hurt to have a couple more enemies that make you change your fighting style, even if just a bit. The most interesting thing the game does is enemies with shields, forcing you to find a way to hit them from behind. Also, because enemies are mostly specific to each planet, the game can rarely create more interesting enemy combinations. A criticism I've always had of the Ratchet & Clank games is that I don't feel stimulated to weapon swap often. I like swapping between weapons, and to be fair, I do it a decent amount, but a solution really has to be found for the weapon wheel. The weapon wheel in Ratchet & Clank games flat out pauses the gameplay, creating constant gaps in the combat flow in the process. It just doesn't feel good to swap weapons. Even worse, because these games have so many weapons, they often have multiple weapon wheels, which is the case in Rift Apart as well. So instead of quickly flicking to the weapon I want like in Doom Eternal, I now have to go to another page and select my weapon there. The D-pad does allow 4 weapons to be quick selected to, that's great, but it has made me rely heavily on those 4 weapons instead of using everything in my arsenal. A solution I came up with is putting my quick select weapons on the second weapon wheel, so I could use the first one to place all my other most used weapons. Nice idea, but unfortunately Insomniac made it so you always open the weapon wheel that your current gun belongs to. If instead it always opened the first weapon wheel first, I could rely on muscle memory way better. Another problem I've always had with Ratchet & Clank is the ammo system. In my last video I said that if a player can't reliably recover a certain resource, they will try their hardest not to spend it, and that's what more or less happens. These games always have many weapons, but a lot of them are heavy, one-use weapons with relatively low ammo. I tend to rarely use them just in case I might need them later. Like most games, you'll rarely actually run out of ammo for everything, but unfortunately humans with their hunter-gatherer brains can't comprehend that and will spend most of their time shooting with the weapons that are worth the least to them, instead of the weapons that might be most fun. The way you recover ammo in Ratchet & Clank games is by smashing specific ammo crates. Health is given by smashing health crates, by the way. The ammo that's in the ammo crates is random, or at least partly random. These crates make the combat essentially unsustainable. You'll slowly drain resources and rely on the game developers to give you crates to smash, and you rely on the game developers to then give you the ammo you want. Compare this to Doom, where the game's mechanics make sure that as long as there are enemies to fight, you can be certain you will have the resources to fight them. Because the enemies are the resources. I wonder if Ratchet can do something similar. I already like that the Topiary Sprinkler gives you health if you damage enemies that are affected by the weapon. Once upgraded at least. If they made that weapon recharge, bam, you have push forward combat. Then maybe another similar weapon turns enemies into ammo if you kill them while affected by it. And bam, the combat is now self-sustaining. I think this totally fits with the style of these games. It's in my opinion the missing puzzle piece. But that might again be because I love Doom, where you throw everything you have every fight. Still, something to think about. A last really big criticism I have of Rift Apart, and again a lot of the other Ratchet games, is that throughout the game you slowly cleanse planets of enemies. So by the time you're done with the game, many of the worlds are just empty wastelands, with maybe only some low-level enemies spawning at specific locations. Games that do this and don't allow me to replay specific encounters always annoy me. There are a lot of fights that I want to experience again, a lot of combat arenas I've only played through once. At this point it's impossible to change that, but in future games I beg Insomniac, please, either respawn enemies in combat arenas, allow us to activate encounters manually, or spawn random enemies throughout the levels. Those were most of my thoughts on Rift Apart's combat. Overall, I really enjoyed it. It may have some repetitive elements to it, but the game, through its level, mechanic and enemy design, crossed the fun threshold, making me not just enjoy every moment, but even look forward to more. And if that isn't praise, I don't know what is. Thank you for watching, I'll see you around. Please subscribe.